it's striking the different words being used. Obviously, military mutiny. We've even had references to civil war, and Putin himself has actually used that phrase. Putin has in the past been quite clever in the way that when he does talk about the civil war of 1917 to 1921, he uses that, I think, in a way to bring together the two sides. He, of course, comes from the intellectual tradition, if you like, of the whites, not of the reds, not of the Soviet side. And quite often he shocked the Soviet loyalists when he brought back the bodies of white generals and put up monuments to them and all the rest of it. And of course, there are no really Soviet symbols in the Kremlin anymore, and certainly not in his palace on the Black Sea. But the intriguing thing about Putin at this particular moment is the very fact that he should actually use that particular phrase, because the Civil War is something really in Russian folk memory. It is so horrific, the consequences, the effect that it had, not just on the generation of the time, but even of subsequent generations. And when Stalin died, I mean, everybody was in tears, not because necessarily they were crying for Stalin. It was because of the fear of civil war. And this is why he's going to brandish that particular element. But he's really, I think the really striking thing is that we have not seen any great resistance on the part of the Russian army, whether in Rostov-on-Don or in Voronezh. Now, does this mean that Wagner and Putin are going to have an easy run all the way to Moscow? I think that would be hard to imagine. And yet, at the same time, it's almost impossible to predict what's going to happen over the next day or so.
So, Antony, it strikes me that this time what we're seeing is two military forces going up head to head. Prigozhin has been upset because he claims that the Russian military fired on his troops. That's something that the Russian military are denying. He holds accountable the Minister of Defense and the head of the Russian forces. What seems to be lacking in this confrontation is where the Russian people are. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's much more important at the moment, but as you rightly say, two military groups sort of head to head. I think the Russian people are sort of simply bewildered and in many cases in a state of mixture of sort of apathy, really, more than anything else. I think the important point here is what happens really in almost the next few hours. Everything will depend on the momentum which Prigozhin can actually establish. But it is very striking that he has not made any promises or political statements, even though it's quite clear that he has got political ambitions. He's claiming that it's not a coup d'etat, and you know what the dividing line is between a mutiny and a coup d'etat in this particular case is sort of very hard to recognize. But at the same time, if he forges ahead and shows complete confidence, and Putin, who was certainly looking shaken in that press conference, gives the impression that he does not have the real strength to face down this opposition, we are in a very unpredictable situation.
The Russian opposition leader has said that Russia is on the brink of a 1917-style revolution. Do you agree with that?
No. I mean, 1917 showed, I'm talking now February 1917, certainly not the Bolshevik coup d'etat of October, but in the genuine revolution of February 1917, we did see the reality really of revolution in the sense that it doesn't depend quite so much on the activists themselves. It depends very much more on the confidence of the ruling power. If Putin can keep his nerve, and he has the National Guard and a whole lot of other organizations, FSB and so forth, then he'll almost certainly remain in power and Prigozhin will not prevail. But I mean, the success of any insurrection, uprising, whatever it might be, really does depend very much on really the ruling elite and to what degree they keep their nerve.
There are reports on social media at the moment who are tracking President Putin's plane that it's taken off from Moscow and heading to St. Petersburg. Of course, we don't know if President Putin is on board. We can assume he might be. If, Sir Antony, this attempt at a military coup, even though Prigozhin doesn't think it is a military coup or say it is a military coup, if this fails, what can we expect from President Putin?
Well, a savage repression of any people who he suspects supported Prigozhin in these circumstances. But I mean, what's extraordinary is just literally even a few days ago, there were reports that actually Prigozhin was working very closely with Putin. And Putin has always relied on divide and rule. And there are so many different organizations, whether Army, GRU, FSB, and all the rest of it, to say nothing of National Guard, which, in theory at least, takes its orders directly from Putin himself. It was thought that Prigozhin was allowed so much leeway in recent weeks and months because he was actually going to act as Putin's enforcer. Now, that certainly seems to be the opposite of the case at the moment. So those who are assuming that the situation was reasonably under control from the Kremlin's point of view certainly appear to have got it wrong.
There is a lot of talk from both sides about patriotism. Prigozhin is saying, my fighters are patriots. We heard President Putin's address earlier on TV. Again, the idea of what it means to be a patriot and defend your country. Where do you think this is going to end, Sir Antony? Because you can't have two patriots disagreeing with each other in one country. Do you think there is a negotiated solution out of this, or does it end with either one of them basically being taken out of the picture?
I think it's definitely that. It will end with one of them being taken out of the picture. But the knock-on effect, the real consequences, will be the blow to the confidence, really, of Russia itself, and of course to the Russian army fighting in Ukraine. And it's hardly surprising that the Ukrainians are thrilled with this development. I mean, that's given them a huge boost because many of those in the front line, especially down in the south under attack, begin to wonder, who we're fighting for, who's really our sort of commanders. And I think that it's the confusion, the lack of certainty that has now put into the minds really of the Russian troops will have perhaps a more important effect than almost anything else. I would be surprised to see a total change of regime in Russia as a result of this, but one can never predict, and especially not on the basis of history. History is not a predictive mechanism, and I don't think there's anything that we can look at the moment. And certainly, military mutinies historically have never really ever led to a regime change, and that is why often they are definitely different to a revolution in the conventional civil sense.
Sir Antony, just before we go, I just want to bring it back to the Russian people. Do you think that they will have a role to play? Of course, events are unfolding very quickly as we speak. As you said, the next 4 or 5, 10 hours are going to be crucial. But do you think that the Russian people still have a part to play?
No, I think this is the real difference, especially with February 1917, where they did indeed have a major role. In fact, it was a popular revolution. This is now a totally different situation because being a military one, essentially, as you rightly pointed out earlier on, means that actually they are only bewildered bystanders, not even full observers, because they will only see the Russian-controlled, Kremlin-controlled media with its version of events. So I don't think that they are in a position anyway to intervene. We will not see a popular uprising in the streets or anything like that. The police and National Guard, I think, are certainly strong enough to keep the situation under control from a Kremlin point of view. So it really does depend entirely on, I think, on the military. And as you rightly say, we'll see over the next few hours what's going to happen.